in other summers, not much. And this is a dramatic change from the average 30-year conditions. It means that we're losing a lot of our Arctic summer sea ice, with all the consequences for life forms, with all the consequences for the peoples who live dependent on life forms in those high latitude zones. And here's the current picture from last night where we are. This blue line is showing us that at the moment the ice is still just about going to start melting in the next couple of weeks, maybe in the next month or so. But at the moment we're trundling along more than 2 standard deviations away from the average, indicating that, well, if things go this way, we're going to face a similar situation of more extreme losses of summer sea ice this year once again. Now, why is that important? Well, if you think about history, here's a statue of Sir John Franklin, which you'll see if you walk down the Mall in London. He was the famous Arctic explorer who spent his life trying to find that Northwest Passage. In the end, he failed, and he perished with something like 129 of his crew, landlocked in the ice, or ice-locked in the Canadian archipelago. And when they found eventually his ship and his crew, the bones of his crew had been scratched. They all died, but the bones had been scratched with metal, indicating that they probably had resorted in the end to cannibalism to try and stay alive. So very much different landscape, a different kind of environment from what we're seeing today. Today we're seeing the Arctic opening up. We're seeing ore tankers which can make the journey all the way to China in a couple of weeks, as opposed to taking much longer to go way around the south coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, away around the Straits of Malacca. Very much more expensive voyage. Now they can save $300,000 a trip by simply skipping over the northeast passage during the summer months. And the Arctic, of course, becoming one of the contested zones in the world for the future. Mr. Putin will no doubt start flexing his muscles up here because there are large amounts of oil, large amounts of gas to be found here as well. And in this fragile environment, of course, the possibility of damage to the ecosystems here is much, much greater than in other parts of the world. Now, the other aspect of the fifth assessment report, just to mention, is that it has become increasingly confident that the causes of all these particular events, these changes in trend, is primarily not natural, but human. So now you're looking at a 1 in 20 chance of these having been caused naturally, rather, you wouldn't really get on a plane with a 1 in 20 chance of crashing, I think. So here you have the odds stacked up. For most scientists, that debate is over in terms of whether it's human or natural. It's a debate which ended maybe 10 years ago. And we know that the causes, therefore, of those dramatic changes in ice, temperature and rainfall are, of course, due to this increasing greenhouse gas loading in the atmosphere, which, if we continue at the present business as usual scenario, will see us add 16,000 million tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere by mid-century. Very optimistic curves here showing us peaking in the next few years and reducing, but I think most realists would not suggest this is going to happen. So as a consequence of those emissions, our concentrations of carbon dioxide last summer exceeded 400 parts per million for the first time. Seasonally it will come down again for a while and go up again next summer. But you can see how different it is from pre-industrial levels, even from the levels when Mr. Teeling started his observatory in Mauna Loa in the 1950s here. Pre-industrial levels were about 280 parts per million. So we're well on the way to increasing those substantially. And if we do continue on that business as usual scenario, unfortunately we only have a 50-50 chance of avoiding a very high global temperature increase by the end of this century. We only have a very little chance of avoiding a much greater frequency of extreme events in many parts of the world occurring as well. And with rainfall, similarly, we know that the places that are wet are going to get wetter, and the places that are dry are going to get drier. But those drier places, unfortunately, are places where rainfall is a matter of life and death. It's not a matter of life and death to us, but it is a matter of life and death to many parts of the developing world, who themselves, of course, have not had any hand out or part in the problem that we're now facing. And it is them who suffer. It is them who bear the brunt of those kinds of changes in extremes. You've probably forgotten Typhoon Haiyan, but again, we can't tie an individual event, but we can say that there was a climate change contribution to the intensity of this, the most ferocious cyclone ever to make landfall in the eastern parts of Asia. And of course, going even into the developed world, we know the effects of Katrina here, we know the effects of Sandy a few years back in the eastern seaboard of North America. All of them not something we will say is caused by climate change, but something where climate change we can see has made a contribution. Perhaps the most serious and most worrying place of all is Bangladesh, where you can see the kind of topography here of this country, maybe 4 or 5 meters above sea level for the most part. Here's Ireland by comparison, so it's not that much bigger than Ireland, but we have 6 million people. We have 160 million people crammed into that space. So if you're living with 50, 60 million people in this zone, then quite clearly a 1 meter rise in sea level may lose you 20% of your country. Now there's nowhere for those people to go in that crowded country. They're already the poorest of the poor, living in areas where they know there's a risk of catastrophic cyclone overwashing those low-lying lands. So we're going to face issues, I think, in terms of countries like that, in terms of countries like the low-lying coral atolls, which see their cultures disappearing, see their countries disappearing as a consequence of sea level rise. Some of them have already started evacuation. For Ireland, our own modelling work in the north here shows us, yes, we're going to continue our own temperature rise as well. We're going to see, in general, wetter conditions along the west coast in particular during winter time, and drier conditions along the east coast during summertime. And that's something that we have to really think a lot about. We're going to find water becoming a relatively scarce commodity in the east of Ireland, where of course we all have our population centres, mainly. So we're going to have to think about rivers like the Boyne, not too far from you here, where we can expect to see winter increases in flow, but summer decreases occurring. And as we work our way through the century, you can see how that becomes more severe, with higher flows in the winter. That means more flooding. That means we have to think about flood protection. And in the summer, low flows, which means we have to think about a lot of other things, such as municipal water supply, such as the dilution of effluent, such as competition between cities, farmers, power stations for water, for using water for various purposes. So these are the practical adaptations that we have to think a little about. For the winter, of course, we see these very familiar scenes from winter time over the past few winters of places which we maybe shouldn't have built houses in the first place, or are now flooded. And major cities like Cork here, underwater by and large during the floods of 2009. So those are things we have to think a little about in terms of too much water. In terms of too little, here's the little work we did in the Boyne a number of years ago, where we asked the question, well, let's look at population projections for this catchment. How many people? Let's look at their water consumption. Let's look at how likely it is that they're going to have enough water or not. And then feed into our models the what-if questions. What if we reduce leakages? What if we reduce demand, make it more efficient? Do the kind of measures that you're doing here in DkIT to conserve water where possible? How often or how long does it stave off from having too little water in your taps and too little water for your fields even during the summer? And these kind of questions therefore give us an idea as to when we might need to invest, when we might need to plan for other water supplies, or think about our settlement policy a little more radically. Other aspects which come to mind here are during the wet winters, of course, the water table will rise. And during winters like we've just had, the water table in many parts of Ireland was very close to the surface. And if you've got a leaking septic tank, that causes problems. You know how much of the problems of flooding was caused by contaminated water, mainly from storm flow rather than septic tanks. But septic tanks have to be thought about as well. And here, a rather surprising map, because I always thought that the septic tanks issue was urban versus rural, but it's not. Most of the density of septic tanks are highest around our towns and cities. That's where the big problem is, rather than in the rural parts. So we have to start thinking about, okay, where is the groundwater going to be vulnerable? Where are the aquifers likely to be vulnerable? Where is the extra rainfall likely to come? Can we do a risk analysis of where we might have to be much more cautious about allowing planning, for example, to allow higher densities of septic tanks in particular areas? And that's the kind of adaptation that we have to think a little more about. Water is something that really surprises everybody when you suggest how much water we need. And here's just some stuff that surprised me quite recently. You know, if you're into using bottled water, it takes about 5 litres of ordinary water to produce that. It takes about almost 1,000 litres of ordinary water for a loaf of bread, and about 15,000 for a kilogram of beef. To produce, in terms of the crop, in terms of the fertilizers, in terms of the transport, and so on. So, although we talk about our carbon footprint, our water footprint is very considerable as well. And some recent work that's been done by the Institute of European and International Affairs here in Ireland has added up how much water the average Irish person needs in a day, or consumes in a day, directly or indirectly, from the products you eat, from the bar of chocolate that was based on water in Ghana, from the milk from somewhere in Ireland. And the figure is 3,600 litres. Which really I find extremely hard to buy at first, but if you think a little about it, 97% of it is invisible. Most of it is agricultural products, but even some industrial products as well, which means that we are consuming vast amounts of water from the third world, essentially, in many ways. So we must think about our water footprint as well as our carbon footprint. Now, the other aspect of those changes, of course, are changes in our landscape. Our landscape as well is dynamic, and a lot of our landscape depends on the kind of moist, mild, maritime climate that we have at the moment. So we have to ask how vulnerable things like our boglands, our turlough, the machair of the west coast is going to be in a situation where summers become drier. We have to start planning for trying to retain those essential elements of the Irish landscape. And we're not doing very well in some of our bogs, of course. We're not doing very well in terms of saving the carbon stores which those valuable ecosystems provide us with. And we have this myth that people are out with spades busily just eking out a few sods of turf, when in fact it's a much more mechanised operation. But we have to think also about species. A number of years ago, we did a questionnaire of American Irish in America, and we asked them, well, what would you miss about Ireland if climate change occurred along the lines proposed? And we thought they would say the bogs. We thought they would say the kind of cultural icons of turloughs or bogs. In fact, what they said they miss most would be the cry of the curlew, things that are deeply embedded in our psyche. And many of our species are close to their southern limits. Arctic char are not going to do well when the mountains warm up and the lakes continue to warm up for them. Species such as salmon, close to their southern limit in Europe, not going to do too well. So these are kinds of things that we can have to model and see who's going to lose as climate change, who's going to win as climate changes, and we can do sort of GIS-based analysis here. This is the dwarf willow, and you can see, well, it's going to disappear across the Irish landscape with these changes should they occur. And other species like Euphorbia here, you can see are winners, will be quite happy to colonise the space left behind, in many cases by plants that are no longer viable in a changed climate. But unfortunately, some of the species we don't want to see expand. The giant rhubarb, here it is on Achill Island, infesting a large area of land here, and you've seen them on roadsides and other places, invasive species which can cope much better with the changed conditions that we're likely to see around Ireland. At a more practical level, we can model how our agricultural crops will fare. And we've done this for cereals here, and the news is quite good. We won't do too much damage to our cereal productivity because a little extra heat will actually be beneficial, and especially in places to the west which are a wee bit moister in the summer, yields will increase. So, okay, they may decrease on the east coast a bit, but certainly overall, for wheat, for barley, we won't do too bad. For potatoes, yeah, the story is very different. This cultural icon of a crop depends on summer rainfall, depends on the August rainfall, the July rainfall to swell up the tubers. If that doesn't happen, then especially in the east here in the drier parts, we either have to contemplate irrigation or grow something else. So these kinds of changes will alter the balance. Even grass, our most important crop, may not do so well in the years ahead on the east coast. One of the things that we've been looking at very recently has been new pests and new diseases, which we feel could pose threats to productivity, especially in our forests. Now, some of them are not new. The pine weevil, for example, if you look at a pine stump, you may see these things crawling around in it. They can do a lot of damage to pine trees, young pine plantations in particular. Native pests like this are going to do extremely well in a warm climate. But there are others coming in, which we haven't got yet, which I think we have to watch out for in the next few years. This is the one that I think I'd like to draw your attention to first. It's the horse chestnut leaf miner. Looks nice. It was first discovered way down here in Macedonia in the mid-1980s. And since then, it has made its way all the way through Europe, right up across the English Channel. By 2005, it was beginning to spread through the English lowlands, and today it's sitting in Holyhead waiting for the boat. So it's kind of the kind of thing to watch for in the next few years. This is what it does to our chestnut trees. They start showing signs of senescence by June and July. The leaves begin to fall. And unfortunately, the eradication success rate is 2%. So watch out for your chestnut trees this summer and see if you see any of these kind of premature aging signs by July and August, because unfortunately that may well mean that this particular pest has arrived at that point. Quick word on mortality. We love a heat wave in Ireland. We enjoyed last summer. We know that in some parts of Europe, heat waves do cause very substantial increases in the death rate. This is Paris in 2003, when all the young people went off to the south for their holidays, drove off along the motorway to Nice and Cannes and Monte Carlo, and the old folks were left behind in their apartment blocks, and they began to die in huge numbers as the temperature got up well above 35 degrees centigrade for the first fortnight in August. We know that something like 40 or 50,000 people now died in Europe from that particular event. And you can see the way that the peak occurred here and then fell away as soon as the temperature fell away shortly afterwards. Clear relationship with temperature. Doesn't happen in Ireland, you say, we love it. But here's Kilkenny in 1983, when we had our warmest day in recent decades. We got up to about 31 degrees. We didn't quite reach that last year, but you can see the peak in temperature and the peak in mortality, again, coinciding here, showing us that maybe we have something to think about if heat wave intensity and frequency